So I'm going to talk to you about a group of people who have never been officially categorized by the U.S. as refugees and yet lived the conditions that should have qualified them for that. And I'll start by sharing with you, thank you, something that happened in my family. I was 40 years old last year, and my mom was sharing with us out of nowhere that on her Facebook feed, one of her friends who lives in our hometown in El Salvador had posted that there was gang fighting going on and that she was hiding under her bed and she was asking everyone for prayers. She was hiding in the room with her kids for hours and people were responding. And this led my mom to reminisce about being in a very similar situation in 1980 when I was about almost 5 years old and my sister was a newborn and she was hiding in the room because there were bombings between the guerrilla fighters and the military. And she kind of slipped out of the usual silence is what I noticed, right? That she started to share some of the details about, having just given birth, globs of blood, flowing down her leg as her teeth are chattering uncontrollably, and she's trying to figure out how to protect us in that space, and how it took, being for a week without food to decide this is it, we have to leave, and within weeks we were crossing 3 international borders. So I relish those moments when she slips out of the silence because I realize that I had never heard these stories before. My parents, like a lot of parents, a lot of people who migrate, who flee, who leave under such conditions don't want to relive that and don't want to pass that on to their kids. And so it creates a kind of silence for that next generation. So you have that. And if you think about it, what do we know about Central Americans, right? If you haven't taken a class, if you don't know someone personally, chances are that you know very little. Who are these people? What do they represent? So it wasn't for me until a college class on Central American politics that I learned about the deep-seated inequalities in the region, how much the U.S. played a role in intervening there, in shaping for many decades those really debilitating conditions of poverty for so many people, right? In the 70s and 80s, U.S. support for the military and elites of El Salvador set the conditions for the immensely devastating consequences of the Civil War. They were determined to prevent a communist victory in the region that would stand in the way of U.S. corporations' profits there as part of the Cold War operations under the Reagan administration. And this affected the entire region in different ways. The U.S. Instructed the military leaders on how to commit vicious torture and carry out murder techniques that would also serve the purpose of instilling fear in the rest of the population. And so the military indiscriminately scorched entire villages, and by the end of El Salvador's 12-year civil war, there were at least 75,000 killed. In Guatemala, after their 36-year war, there were 200,000 people killed in what was mostly a genocide against Mayans. There were tens of thousands of more people tortured and disappeared. And so these conditions is what forced what we see now as the migration stream to the US, except that people were never recognized as refugees. So the way that people survived in those moments was to be silent about what was going on. Either you joined the guerrilla fighters, or you kind of clandestinely supported, or you joined the military, or you just pretended that nothing was going on and you said nothing and you hid to read books and you really whispered to your neighbors to try and figure out who's on what side. It was all about silence for survival, right? So that, again, is the backdrop from the side of the migrants, the refugees themselves. The United States, unable to share and accept that they were the ones who were funding what was happening in what was leading to those conditions, never agreed to to consider them refugees, and therefore made it very difficult for many of these populations to access legal status, right? So life in the US has been tough when you have half of your population who either is undocumented or only has temporary protected status, which is as much as many Central Americans can access now, right? But aside from denying that reality of being refugees, another thing that happens is that it denies my parents' generation and my generation's reality of having lived through state terror, and again reproduces a certain kind of silence that gets filled with incorrect kind of assumptions and stereotypes about who these people are. So the denial translates into the kinds of silences that I see now in my classrooms, where children of Central American migrants know very little about who they are. They know that in the Southwest context, they're not Mexican, but that's as much as their identity is based on, right? So in terms of the racialization, even for understanding who the we is in the group, it's become very difficult. There's so little to grasp to give meaning to that. And then the silence gets filled in with stereotypes that are informed in part by the way that presidents discuss the group, right? So you see Reagan in the 80s, he talked about Central Americans as being subversives and extremely violent. And that then has consequences for how people that you live around assume that you are, because there's nothing else to inform them. So then if we move ahead to the aftermath of the wars in Central America, neoliberal policies imposed by the IMF, the World Bank, they didn't account for the needed investment in education, only promoted the creation of jobs, or they didn't promote the jobs that were needed to get beyond anything else than what they call in Central America sueldos de hambre, so wages that would only pay you enough to still live in hunger. And so the boys who had been forcibly recruited to fight in the wars, they still had access to weapons, yet they faced limited opportunities for schooling. Their reintegration to civilian life was structured to block them not only from upward mobility, but also from the much needed emotional and psychological healing after the war process. So during that period in the US, Salvadoran youth and Central American youth more broadly who had settled into poor neighborhoods were met with other forms of violence and exclusion, while their parents worked multiple jobs to deal with the poverty, with the lack of access to resources because most were undocumented, and while they dealt with their trauma in often very unhealthy ways. Youth, especially the boys, joined gangs seeking belonging and protection, and as a result, many were imprisoned in the US. So in the 90s, after the peace accords were signed in El Salvador and in Guatemala, the US began to deport gang members who had been incarcerated here, and arriving there with no educational opportunities, no labor opportunities, they weren't able to do much to find their way there, right? So unable to find dignity in the most traditional forms, deportees and other impoverished youth instead devised power and survival in gangs. That's where they found a home. So today, in the continued very deep inequalities of that region, there's very little opportunity for a dignified life. And in turn, gangs have really found a force. This is also happening within a broader context of the drug war, also funded by the US. This is happening in a broader context of neoliberal policies that are promoted by the US. And so US intervention continues to affect the region in such a way that we're now seeing refugees fleeing that kind of violence, right? So there's parallels there, but the silence around Central Americans continues. And like I said, it gets filled in with misinformation. So if you think about, what do you know about Central America? And if you don't have friends, if you don't live in a place where there is a Central American population, and you only look to television, to movies, right? I have my students do this in my class because, they look for representations of Central Americans, and for years now, the only things that they're able to find are these very tiny characters. For the women, they're all these sassy maids. All the Central American women, that's what we can aspire to. And for the men, you know, one of the most popular National Geographic documentaries ever is this World's Most Dangerous Gang documentary that portrays Salvadorans as, you know, practically animals, right? And so these are the only representations to kind of give us a sense of who are these people when you've had, you know, silence everywhere else, even from the population themselves, right? So I know that they asked us to cut down a whole lot. So let me say that what we're seeing now, and I gave you a little bit of the context for why we have a situation where gangs are such a problem and where the drug war has harmed the region so much, and that we are now seeing a new population of what should, under the 1951 Refugee Convention, should count as refugees, but are never thought of in that way. What we're seeing is that under President Obama, we saw the images, we heard for a little bit humanitarian crisis, but ultimately in practice and in the ways that his administration promoted the detention months on end of Central American mothers and children, they referred to this population as threats to national security. And so, again, in this, you know, huge silence, here's another little piece of information about who these people are, right? Now you have Trump, and now, you know, we're still trying to figure out, and I hope this is something that we can talk about in the Q&A. Trump is really filling that silence with information loudly, right, in a lot of ways, but in terms of Central Americans in particular, this was soon after he was elected. He was interviewed, he was Time Magazine's Person of the Year, and in that interview, when they talked about migration and how are his policies going to be different from Obama's, he suggested that Obama was too nice and didn't really understand how evil people can be. And he draws on this tabloid in New York that is focusing on a case that took place there of apparently Central American young people who had arrived who committed a heinous crime there. And so now his thinking about immigration policy, and again, remember the silence, right? So anytime you see Central American in public, here's a sign of who these people are. His words, they come from Central America, they're tougher than any people you've ever met, Trump says. They're killing and raping everybody out there. They're illegal and they are finished. And so that's step number one, right? This was in December of 2016. And so we know there's more and more images of these people who are so desperate that they ride freight trains and they lose their limbs and they die trying to get to the United States, staying in Mexico more and more frequently now. We've seen these images, but we have a president now who is more explicitly targeting them as the real criminals. On January 25th, when Trump announced his executive orders on immigration to a room full of Border Patrol and ICE officers, this is what he said. We're in the middle of a crisis on our southern border. The unprecedented surge of illegal migrants from Central America is harming both Mexico and the United States. And there's a lot more to it. He's suggesting that the reason for the wall is to protect his friends in Mexico and make sure that we're safe in the US from the real enemy, which are the Central Americans. And so I want to provide that context to you. The Central Americans themselves, ourselves, barely have anything to understand our experience, because it was silence that protected us when we arrived and we escaped. It's silence that protects us when we're undocumented. It's the silence that was imposed by the state when it never recognized the role that it played in creating the atrocities there. And so to fill it with this kind of information is a really problematic kind of racialization for Central Americans that I hope that we'll keep track of. And we know that when Trump opened up his campaign by stating that Mexicans are rapists and criminals, and there was a huge uproar. Everybody, really felt that this was wrong, right? There's been a lot of silence around these comments. And so I want to, bring this to the conversation to think about what is he doing in trying to racialize groups in these ways? How is he creating divisions between groups? And then who's going to stick up for people who have been relegated to silence? Thank you.